Hello and welcome. My name is Kevin Muehlman and I'm with the John Brademas Center of New York University. Today's event is part of our Young Leaders Network and is co-hosted with the Arab American Institute and NYU Washington, D.C.'s Salon Series. With us today is Dr. James Zogby, the co-founder of Arab American Institute, and Paul Salem, the president of the Middle East Institute. And we will be discussing Dr. Zogby's new book, The Tumultuous Decade, which is also available to purchase on Amazon. And a link is on our event website. Thank you for joining us. And then if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we will be devoting time to the end of the discussion for your questions. Paul, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everybody. As Kevin mentioned, my name is Paul Salem. I'm the president of the Middle East Institute, and I'm in Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to be with this Young Leaders Network at the John Brademas Center of NYU. I wish we could be there in person. And it's a great pleasure and privilege to lead a conversation with my good friend, Dr. Jim Zogby, about his new book, The Tumultuous Decade, Arab Public Opinion, and the Upheavals of 2010 to 2019. As Kevin mentioned, Jim is the president of the Arab American Institute, which he co-founded in 1985. He's also director of Zogby Research Services, a firm that's conducted groundbreaking surveys across the Middle East for many, many years. He's also served for 3 decades in leadership roles in the Democratic National Committee. He served for 2 terms as President Obama's appointee to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And in addition to all that, he has a great weekly webinar called Coffee and a Column. I recommend that you read his column and you join him on that weekly webinar. This new book, The Tumultuous Decade, brings together 10 years of public opinion polling in a number of Arab countries, as well as Turkey and Iran. This was a decade of great tumult. It saw the rise of the Arab Spring and its deterioration, saw the eclipse of Al-Qaeda by ISIS. It saw a number of humanitarian and refugee tragedies from Yemen to Syria and beyond. We saw wide swings in great power policy towards the region, with a retrenching US and a resurgent Russia and an emerging China, and continued socioeconomic challenges for the people of the region. The period also saw Tunisia manage a tenuous democratic transition. We saw a path of moderate political and economic reform in Morocco, and recently popular attempts at positive reform in Sudan and Algeria. This book brings together thousands of voices from the region. It puts forward how respondents assess their own top priorities. How do they assess the involvement of other countries in their regions? How do they view the proper role of religion? What's their attitude towards democracy? And many, many other interesting questions. This book was co-published by Zogby Research Services and our own Middle East Institute, and as Kevin mentioned, is available from Amazon as a Kindle book or a physical book. So Jim, let's get started. I know you have a lot to say. I guess, what are the main findings of the book? Let's start there.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I'm tempted to say, when you said, I look forward to the day when we can be together, part of me feels like Kramer in that episode of Seinfeld where he discovered that he loved being in the shower so much he tried to arrange his whole life around being in the shower with everything around. This is kind of like it, you know. You can sit here with a shirt on and your pajamas in your kitchen and spend the rest of your life doing this. It's a little bit alienating, but nevertheless, I think we're getting used to it after all these months. Look, the book was I always call it a labor of love. The polling is fun. It's something we've been doing since the 90s. We started polling consumer satisfaction in Arab countries. It was a new thing. People weren't doing a lot of polling, but people discovered there, both in business, in media, and in government, the importance of finding out what people were thinking, and satisfaction with government services, satisfaction with commercial services, what they're watching on television, and what they want in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of what they want the government to do. Beginning in 2011, we started polling for a conference that took place in the fall in the UAE called Serbaniyas, and the polling in this book reflects the annual polls that we did for Serbaniyas. The conference itself is extraordinary. It's very smallish. You've been there, but the polling has been great because it allows us to go to 10 countries annually with a range of issues around controversial questions that would otherwise remain unexplored. Everything from, like I said, about how they feel about whether their governments are living up to expectations, how they feel about whether the Arab Spring is something that they find have confidence in making change, how they feel about Iran, how they feel about extremism and extremist movements. The results are here, and it allows us, polling is a snapshot. It gives you a moment in time, but when you poll over a 10-year period, the snapshot becomes like a film, like a movie, because you see the segments and you see it evolving. Let's take a look at some of the findings. As you note, we covered a range of topics. The first one was Iraq, and it was Iraq because, if anything defines the transition from the first decade of the 20th century to the second decade, it was the American departure from Iraq. Excuse me. As foolish as the war was, and as devastating an impact that the war had, that was only compounded by the departure, by the U.S. departure. It was one of those things where we found, as we polled in Iraq, people were deeply conflicted. They both wanted the U.S. to go, but they were petrified as to what would happen when the U.S. did go. And that almost matched the polling we did in October of 2003, when the war had just begun, when Iraqis were rather convinced that the U.S. was not a liberating army, but was an occupying army. And yet, even then, there was a panic as to what would follow. And it was something that I don't think U.S. policymakers ever factored into the picture. There was the myth that the war in Iraq would overthrow the dictator. There'd be flowers in the street. People would be singing America's praises. Iraq would become a democracy, and it would spread throughout the whole Middle East. And by the way, because the ideological framework for the Iraq war was created by the Project for a New American Century, which was a group of neoconservatives who said that if we won this war decisively, it would ensure American hegemony for the next century, and would ensure the fact that we'd be a unipolar world where no one else would be able to equal us. Well, it turned out exactly the other way. I mean, we got dragged into a conflict of never ending by a ragtag army of insurgents that we called every name in the book, from dead enders and losers, but they tied down the mightiest army, or was thought to be the mightiest army in the world. And instead of becoming the unipower, the sole superpower, a multipolar world emerged, where today it's not just Russia and China competing with America for influence in parts of the world, and China actually becoming a dominant force in Asia. But at the same time, there are regional powers at play: Saudi Arabia and Iran, most decisively Iran, but also Turkey and even little Qatar, fighting way above its weight, but pouring money into groups and conflicts around the region. And America stands powerless at this point to be able to affect change. Iran was unleashed by the Iraq War, and polling there showed that. Iraqis, if you ask them today what their biggest concern with Iran is, it's not Iran's nuclear program. It's the influence that Iran has in their own country. If you ask them back in 2011 when America was leaving what they feared most, they feared sectarian conflict, and they feared that a neighbor would become involved, which was their way of saying Iran. And that was something, interestingly enough, that went across sectarian lines. People were deeply concerned about that. When you look at Iraq today, what you find is that the Iraqi people are still pretty much concerned about America's role. They want American support. They want America's investment, but they're worried about the role that America plays in securing its interests and not their interests. And they're deeply concerned with Iran. They actually would like to be left alone, if anything. And when you ask them what they want in the form of governance, it's contrary to the sort of the naive approach that some policymakers here in the States had. Well, we ought to just partition the country. It ought to be partitioned a Kurdish area, Sunni and Shia area. That's not what Iraqis want. Iraqis want a unified country, but they want a unified country without external influence that is able to pursue reform and reconciliation among all the groups. It's interesting that in Iran, you find when you poll the public, they want unified country. They don't want sectarian identity. It's the groups, the empowered groups who have external backers, who are the ones pushing the sectarian agenda. I remember I used to do a television show that was a broadcast from Abu Dhabi and here in the States. And we would do these programs that would connect people by satellite and in different parts of the world. I had students at the university, at Davidson College in North Carolina, connected with students in Baghdad. And we did it at the 4th anniversary of the war. And when the kids at Davidson were asking the Baghdad kids, well, you know, what about the Sunni Shia? It's like right after the Iraq War, Americans got to know Sunni, Shia, Mujahideen, Jihad, you know, 5-6 words of Arabic. And if you knew 4 of them, you could be an expert. Maybe you even use them in a sentence. And the Iraqi kids were confused. And so I asked the question, I said, how many of you have Sunni and Shia in your family? Every hand in the Iraqi group went up. Iraq had intermarriage. There was no such thing as sectarian division in the country. It's the groups that are funded or supported by external players who've been promoting the sectarian agenda. That's not what Iraqis want. And I think that should be taken into consideration as we look at it. But unfortunately, American policymakers haven't been doing it. The other big event, and Iraq incidentally is still a destabilizing force in the Middle East. I mean, in the sense that Iran sees it as a playground, and Turkey is involved, and the US is clearly involved, and ISIS is resurgent because of sectarian politics that have been pursued by the government. And you see these street protests that are erupting, which are really quite significant, I think, that need to be attended to, because in Iraq, you have a street protest that is against the militias, against Iran, and for government reform. And it is, I think, it's in the hands of these young kids. The future of the country is going to be decided. Let's go to Arab Spring, because as decisive as the US withdrawal from Iraq and leaving Iraq in the hands of Iran and sectarian decision-making that brought ISIS into the picture, as decisive as that was, so too was Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was the other big factor in 2011 that sent the region reeling. And as opposed to what the Bush administration had thought was a democracy wave, it set off something far more destabilizing than a wave of democracy. It looked great in the beginning, and I always say that when people don't know what's going on in looking at an event, they tend to impose something else they do know on top of it. So they see what they don't know through the prism of what they do know. So it was called the Arab Spring here in the West, because we saw it like Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. Just like when troops went into Baghdad in 2003, we saw it as the liberation of Paris. You know, you impose what you do know on top of what you don't know, makes all kinds of dangerous consequences resulting from that. But it wasn't the Prague Spring. It wasn't the fall of the Soviet Union. It was rather a mass protest that was legitimate against repression and against economic hardships. But there was no organized political force behind it. There was no party. And the only political party that was capable of forging some political power out of this movement was the Muslim Brotherhood. And it pursued a sectarian agenda that was alienating to the very young people who led the revolt. It brought the military in, who then squashed the Muslim Brotherhood and the youth who led the secular youth who led the revolt. And you brought Egypt back almost to square one, to where it was during the times before the protest. And so when we poll over the years, in the first couple of years, there was a sense of, this is great. I mean, Arab public opinion thought it was really quite interesting and looked hopeful about what was happening in Egypt and Tunisia in particular. But as the years went on, especially after the Muslim Brotherhood takeover in Egypt, and then the military takeover after that, moods soured, and people became quite distressed about the fact that what they had thought might be hopeful turned out not to be hopeful. And so today, when you poll in the Arab world, Egypt gets failing points for what's happened there. The one place that looks like it still has some promise is Tunisia, and people do give it some fairly good ratings in terms of prospects for looking good for the future. Let me put up a couple of polls that I think are interesting by themselves about, these are polls in the countries. First slide number one is a slide about the question we ask in every country all the time: are you better off than you were 5 years ago? And I don't know if that slide, yeah, there it is. If you look, you'll see that in Lebanon, where you have street protests, Iraq, where you have street protests, Egypt, where you don't have any, but you have an awful lot of repression right now, the numbers are miserable in terms of better off, worse off. The one country where people...
When was this question asked?
This question was asked in September of 19. September of 19, so fairly recent. Only in Tunisia do you get a majority saying that they're better off than they were. Now, if you look at the next slide, it's expectation for the future. No, back one, there you go. Do you feel you're going to be better off or worse off in the next 5? Again, Tunisia, a majority saying that they feel they're going to be better off, but in Iraq, Lebanon, and Egypt, the numbers are really quite dismal. So Iraq is boiling, Lebanon is boiling, Egypt seems like it's simmering and probably will boil. But Tunisia is the one place where people have a sense of confidence that that things might get better. And actually, as you poll across the Arab world, and you'll see in the book, attitudes of other countries toward Tunisia, the numbers are, people, despite the fact that there's political turmoil in Tunisia and people aren't settled on a government, etc., but people are resolving it peacefully. And as the Arab world looks at it, they say, this is working. They seem to have it under control, and Tunisians themselves are optimistic.
Well, if I may, yeah. I mean, I'd like just to pry a bit on that question of optimism and also, you know, feeling better off. And let me also mention to the audience that you can go ahead and start putting your questions in the Q&A. We'll try to work them in as we go along. My question, Jim, if you pull back and look at the 6 other countries you polled, are there any other countries where there has been optimism or a sense that things have progressed and things are going to be good? I mean, of course, all of this is before COVID, but
yeah, the UAE always looks good. And the numbers there are very optimistic and hopeful. Actually, the numbers you get there are, as we did a poll of 27 countries at one point, they're right up there with Sweden and Norway in terms of people feeling good about the past and then good looking forward. The country that stood, in Iran, the numbers are miserable right now, and you're seeing that reflected in street protests in Iran too. The one country that is, I think, surprising and might be surprising to some, Saudi Arabia, which always had good numbers, but the numbers have gone south in Saudi Arabia, with people feeling less satisfied and less optimistic about the future. And so I think that that's also some concern. I mean, there's obviously economic hardship in the country for the first time ever. They're belt pulling. The revenues are down. Oil prices are down. There's long conflict in Yemen. The poll was done shortly after the bombing of the oil facility, and that was a shock to the Saudi system, and I think that reflected it too. But these numbers are like, and people should take them seriously, because it's a kind of like a yellow flashing light. There's something going on here. Pay attention. This is what a couple thousand people are telling us, and I believe that you ignore them at great risk. Let me just get to the two last countries that would kind of go under the Arab Spring rubric: Yemen and Syria, which devolved rather quickly into just horrific, bloody conflict. 500,000 more dead in Syria. Have no idea of the casualty numbers in Yemen, but because the counts aren't there, but it is obviously an enormous. The UN tells us it's one of the great humanitarian tragedies of this century in terms of starvation and disease. The point is that's how the region sees it too. When we poll about Yemen, in the very beginning, when the GCC first got involved to help, when the protests were led by youth, were toppling the government of Abdullah Ali Saleh, the previous dictator, the GCC got involved and negotiated a compromise where Abdullah Ali Saleh would leave and a new government would come in. The new government was viewed rather favorably in the rest of the region. People thought there's some optimism here that this is going to work. Abdullah Ali Saleh, I'm making another Seinfeld reference. There was the episode where George got fired and kept coming back to work. Well, Abdullah Ali Saleh kept his presidential office, so he stayed in the presidential office next door to the new president and kept interfering in everything, even though he had been deposed. He quickly made an alliance with the Houthi, a rebel group from the north, and civil war ensued. For the first several years across the region, people didn't know what to make of it. Yemen was a sort of a stepchild in the Arab world. It was sort of off in the bottom of the peninsula, and there wasn't much attention paid to it. But in recent years, focuses on the humanitarian tragedy. And when you ask them how do they characterize it, they say it's a humanitarian tragedy that needs attention. Will it end soon? I don't know. Will continued focus be on the humanitarian tragedy side? Absolutely. And when you ask what the solution is, same thing. Yemenis say they want a government that it can achieve reconciliation and bring people together. But there is this north-south division that's really real. And the people in the South are less inclined to trust a government led by the North, as they have not found it to be responsive to their needs. Syria, I think if anything, the Syrian tragedy is one that has made people numb across the region. They have, in the very beginning, from the very beginning, Bashar al-Assad had almost no support in the Arab world. Many countries, 80% said he needed to go. I mean, it wasn't just Barack Obama who said he's got to go. It was across the Arab world. There was the feeling that he's got to go. Today, when you poll, it's very different. Right now, people are saying he's probably going to stay. I mean, there's no sense that he's ever going to go, and that there's any resolution that doesn't include him. Whereas in the past, they only saw a resolution if he was gone. I think that the interesting thing about what's happened in Syria is that there's a sense, it's a sober sense about that the future, yes, is going to include Bashar, but as long as Bashar's there, there's going to be conflict. Conflict between the Syrian government and the opposition, and conflict between the Russian and Iranian long-term goals, and between the Russian and Iranian goals versus those of Turkey. And so Syria has gone from it was a functional, oppressive government to a dysfunctional, fractured, government-less situation that is really quite distressing. Maybe the most interesting thing to come out of Syria, the Syrian conflict, again, not a positive in many ways, is that Iran, which had been viewed very favorably across the Arab world, because it stood up against the West. When the US was fighting this war in Iraq that was killing hundreds of thousands of people, it was Iran that challenged the US. It was Iran that challenged Israel when they occupied South Lebanon and fought that bloody war in 2006, after having vacated Lebanon, but then going back in and occupying part of the country and devastating much of the infrastructure of the country. Iran's favorable rating across the region went up to 70, 80% in some, even in Saudi Arabia, it was 80% favorable rating. When you asked Saudis a question we asked for the BBC in 2008, which leader not from your own country in the region, which leader in the region not from your own country do you most respect? The number one was Nasrallah in Lebanon. The number two was Bashar al-Assad. The number three was Ahmadinejad in Iran, because wow, they were standing firm against the West, even though they were not Sunni, even though they were allied with they were the country that was the enemy of Saudi Arabia. Their blood was boiling in 2008. That gradually began to turn. And if you look at in the book, there's a poll, we do the polling of attitudes towards Iran from 2000, I think 6 is when we start, to today. The numbers go this way, constantly down. And it was Syria that was the nail in the coffin of Iranian favorable rating across the region. And people today, yes, are concerned about Iran's nuclear program. They're concerned about Iran's role in the Gulf. Maybe the biggest concern they have is about Iran's meddling in other countries and the danger that it poses across the region. Let's look just quickly.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Israel Palestine, which
well, before we go on to that, there's a question from an audience member about the Arab Spring issue, and also maybe two questions. One, the person is asking, either in your public opinion polling or in your opinion, when it comes to the Arab Spring, what could have the U.S. done or done differently to encourage a more positive outcome in some of these countries?
Look, I think that probably the smartest speech that Barack Obama gave on the Middle East was the second anniversary of the Cairo speech, where he traced, it was at the State Department, and I got invited to go, and he traced the history of the Arab Spring from the Tunisian fish seller who immigrated himself to where we were then 2 years later. And it was so interesting that he said, we didn't start it, we can't direct it, and we can't determine its outcome. That's for the people of the region to do. We cannot do this. What we can do is provide the building blocks to help democracy grow and flourish. And by building blocks, he said, creating a vibrant economy and middle class that can be the organizing force for change. And he proposed, therefore, that we do job promotion. We invest in job creation. We invest in education. We invest in healthcare reform, et cetera. And when we poll across the region and ask people, what do you want? What do you want most? They never tell us we want more democracy. They never tell us we want more this or that. They tell us they want jobs, healthcare, and education. That's what everybody wants in the world, right? If you ask people what are their priorities, that's what the priorities are. And Obama was smart to recognize that, you know, instead of doing democracy training programs, we had to help elevate the societies and create a more stable economy so that people would advocate for themselves the democracy or the society they want. That unfortunately didn't happen. I said to the person sitting next to me, I said, unlike the Cairo speech, which was an American message to the Arab world, this speech is a message to Congress asking them, come up with the money to do the right thing. They didn't do it. I mean, we give people guns, we give them tanks, and we give them planes, and we send over kids who are still wet behind the ears to talk to them about women's rights, and who don't have a clue about the culture that they're going into. I remember after 9/11, I was asked to meet with the various people who were in charge of public diplomacy, who made these bizarre films that they were broadcasting in Morocco and in Egypt and Tunisia on issues that were made that might have, you know, brought a tear to somebody's eye in Hollywood, and might have, you know, felt good, somebody in Manhattan watching them, but didn't have any clue about the culture of the country they were playing those films in. And so we are not the people who want to be preaching democracy to the world, especially now, given what we're demonstrating. But the point is that as the famous poet, Israeli Arab Palestinian poet wrote, Mahmoud Darwish, every country has its own dawn. Every country has its own experience with change. You cannot impose. We tried to do it in Iraq, it failed miserably. And so Barack Obama was right. Ann Patterson was right when she spoke in Egypt, the U.S. ambassador to Egypt, right before the big demonstrations that overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood. She said, form a political party, organize on the street, win the next election. They didn't do it. And so even till this day, the only real political force that exists in opposition to the government remains the Muslim Brotherhood. And without an organized political movement that can make change, at the end of the day, you are either going to be then controlled by the military or controlled by the organized religious force. That's the only alternative religious force available. And so I think that's the issue that I
before getting to Israel, which we want to, you did mention the UAE, and one of the attendees is asking, when you poll in the UAE, you poll among all residents or just citizens?
We poll three ways. We poll citizens and Arab speakers, because some polls we do are on Arab public opinion, but then we segregate them out, and then we poll all residents. And we've even, we've polled every which way. On the numbers I'm giving you now, in this poll, these are the citizen broader, we have polled the broader, the
expat communities, which are large. Any sense of their public opinion, as it were?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that when we poll the migrant workers in the country, who, despite the fact that the conditions are not good, and you will get pretty broad acceptance of the fact that they're trying to make change, but the government can actually only do so much, especially because it's a state system. And so Dubai has one set of rules, Abu Dhabi has another set of rules. They've actually made some progress in some fronts. In other areas, not enough at all. But the level of satisfaction is fairly high. And here's the point. Even when we've polled in Pakistan, folks who've left the UAE and gone back there to Pakistan, you would think then, okay, well, now they're going to tell me the truth, right? Their attitudes toward the UAE and their experience in the UAE is way more favorable than you would expect it to be. And Pakistanis who know someone who worked in the UAE have a 3 times, no, it's actually a little more than 2 times more favorable attitude toward the country than people who don't know don't know someone who's
Okay, thanks. Let's move
the UAE does fairly well.
Let's move on, as time is limited. I interrupted you when you were beginning to talk about Israel, Israel Palestine, Israel Arab.
Yeah, look, there's no love lost for Israel anywhere across the region. They are viewed as the #1 cause of the problem with the Palestinians. They're viewed as a troublemaker in the region. They're also viewed as a very powerful country that can unlock the U.S. To help their countries out. And so, over the years, when you ask about Israel Palestine, attitudes toward the Palestinians have been strong. People feel it's a very personal issue. I call Palestine the wound in the Arab heart that never healed. It's like bury my heart at Wounded Knee is to indigenous people. This is too, they hear Palestinians or they hear the Nakba and they ache for what they remember. Nevertheless, there's a sense of weariness in the region right now. They're not seeing the issue go anywhere. They see an intransigent Israel that shows no promise of changing. And they see an American government on both Democratic and Republican side that for years has done nothing and doesn't show any sign of, I mean, if Biden wins or Trump wins, Trump is worse in some ways, but in terms of the Israel-Palestine thing, they don't see anything happening from either way. No one is going to stop Israel's sense of impunity that it can do what it wants. Therefore, there's a sense of resignation. And some saying, look, maybe we should normalize. Because if we normalize, at least we'll have some leverage maybe to make some change with Israel. And in evidence of that, you saw this recent op-ed, rather, I thought a gutsy move by the UAE ambassador here to Washington, published in a Hebrew paper in Israel, saying, if you annex the territories, there won't be any normalization with us. Don't even think about it. Palestinians, you can't steal their land and then have good relations with us. Some criticized him for doing it, but I thought that, you know, there's no way that an Arab country is going to physically punish Israel, but what they can do is hold out the promise that we might do something for you, but you have to not annex the territories. And so there was some effort at creating restraint in Israeli behavior. And that's something that we see in the polls and and is reflected in the book.
Well, I mean, the opinion of Palestinians themselves, is it a mood of resignation that the Israelis can do what they're going to do? Do they want to revolt? Do they want to leave?
Yeah, there's a sense of resignation and frustration and not seeing a way forward. And it's tragic, but I think that it can erupt. But I don't, at this point in time, see that in the offing anytime soon. And so it remains a thorn. It remains a painful thing that can erupt. And if it does, will cause reverberations throughout the region. But at the present time, people are looking beyond it to jobs, economy, you know, healthcare, education.
Yeah.
That's the reality.
Let me bring in a question from an audience member that also I wanted to ask. If you could explain a bit to the audience how you do these polling. Is it face? Is it, you know, on telephone? And particularly,
we only do face-to-face polling.
Particularly, how do you manage in countries which are famously repressive? Yeah.
We only poll face-to-face, and we hire local folks to do them. Most of them are college students. And the methodology we use is the one that's accepted for face-to-face polling. There are some pre-poll weights that are applied. We want to make sure we get the right number of men, women, by age group, by region of the country. And we do rather extensive sort of data crunching when it's done to make sure that, we'll take a look and we'll say, oh, wait, look, in this one city in northern Saudi Arabia, we had 27 people polled, and it looks like they all work in education. They must be at the university there. We throw that out and we go and redo it. I mean, we want to make sure that the poll workers have done the right thing, and if the distribution, we do training beforehand. It's only face-to-face. We divide cities into quadrants, and then we re-quadrant, what's ever the expression, we re-divide into subgroups until we come down to a several block area. The poll worker is assigned to that area with, we need this many of this and this many of that, and they go out and do them. And we oftentimes poll in excess of the number that we're supposed to have, just to make sure we get the adequate distribution.
And I have to ask, I mean, in countries which are very repressive, Egypt, Iran, maybe Turkey, others, is it doable? Is that, or I mean, how do you...
It's not only doable, but people actually, when they're speaking to people of their own and their own community, they appear eager to talk. We never polled in Iraq during Saddam's period, never polled in Libya during Gaddafi, never polled in Syria under Assad, but we've polled everywhere else. And we have found actually that people will talk. I mean, look, people say, well, how can you poll in Saudi Arabia? It's a very closed country. Saudis are very eager to talk about things. And when one time we made a mistake in a question in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt. We asked the question, favorable, unfavorable toward these various countries, and is this country making a contribution to regional peace or not? When we ask the question across the region, we will leave, if the country being named is the country we're polling in, we leave it out. So you don't want to ask somebody from Saudi Arabia, is Saudi Arabia making a contribution to regional peace or not? We made a mistake and left it in. And we did the same in Egypt. And 16% of Saudis said it was not making a contribution to regional peace. And where were they? They were largely from the Eastern Province, which is the Shia area, where Saudi Arabia has had not a good relationship with that region. So people say, well, are people telling you the truth? Yeah, that's a pretty gutsy thing to tell somebody that the country you're living in that you are afraid of is not contributing to regional peace and you have an unfavorable attitude toward it. It's pretty good. Palestinians are famously free. Lebanese, you get way too much diversity of opinion there on many issues. Jordanians, Iraqis after the fall of Saddam were very free to tell us all kinds of things, including, like I said right now, including among Shia Iraqis, that Iran is not playing a positive role in their country. And so I find that we're getting some really interesting results.
Well, let me throw in two questions.
The methodology is spelled out in the book in more detail.
Yes, let me throw in two questions from two audience members. There's the book. Buy the book, download the book. One attendee is asking about sort of the connection between the oil industry and U.S. policy in the Middle East. Partly, I know this is, there's public polling about it, if there's any perception there. But also your opinion, how much do the oil titans, as the person is asking, sort of drive U.S. policy in the Middle East? There was some talk during the Iraq invasion that some made a lot of, Iraq's oil resources. Trump keeps saying we want to keep the oil and so on. How much do you think oil factored in and still factors in?
Well, we haven't polled about that. And I think I might want to leave my responses to the polling that we've done. I would think, though, that one area that we have not explored here in terms of the discussion is the role that shale and fracking has played in the current feud that the U.S. has with the region over Saudi Arabia lowering their prices in order to drive the shale folks out of business. That did not sit well here in the U.S. I think that to be sure, any country that's got lots of money is going to have lots of friends, friends in quotes, people that they can influence, people that they can hire, lobbyists that they can bring to the table. Is it decisive? Probably not. But does it have an impact? For sure it does. I mean, Donald Trump was very clear when he went to Saudi Arabia. He was selling weapon systems. He was, looking for investment, and he was looking maybe even for his own personal investment in the region. So clearly it plays a role. But there are other factors, I think, that come to the fore. Is it why we supported Saudi Arabia and Yemen? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that we had left them out of the nuclear deal with Iran. They got pissed and also felt quite threatened by the fact that Iran was going to be raking in money and getting international legitimacy. And Iran was, they viewed, a mortal threat, and a threat that was getting involved in regional conflicts, in particular Syria and Iraq, that was quite destabilizing to them. And so they decided to put their foot down, and they got into this conflict in Yemen because they felt that Iran was going to take advantage of it. It was a terrible mistake on their part. It was a huge blunder. They're paying the price for it now. But Obama felt, look, I screwed leaving them out on the Iran deal. I got to support them on this, or else we lose the relationship that we want to keep. And the U.S. got dragged into a conflict that it, was somewhat responsible for in the first place. If we had included from the very beginning, I felt that if you looked at every regional conflict in that across the area, you saw Iran on one side and Saudi Arabia on another side, whether they were combatants or supporting combatants, or just politically on either side. Part of the solution to the conflicts in that region is a regional confab, like the US, like the OSCE in Europe, that brought East and West to the table. That's what the Iraq Study Group report called for in 2006, and still is needed, to have an arrangement where Iran and Saudi Arabia are at the same table with the US, Europe, and other parties, helping to bridge gaps and differences across the region. We don't have it now. We have not used our political clout to make it happen. And the result is that they're not talking to each other. And we do one, as Obama did, supporting one side, or we do what Trump did, support the other side, but it's not helping bridge the gap and close the gaps in the region.
The clock is ticking on us. We have 10 minutes left. Again, the book we're discussing, and somebody asked us to name the book again, and asked Jim if you could hold it up again for a couple of seconds. It's The Tumultuous Decade, Arab Public Opinion and Upheavals of 2010 to 2019. It's on Amazon. Please download it and read it. An interesting question from a Jonathan Parker, who's on this Zoom call. Do any of the polling questions relate to attitudes on social issues like human rights, women's rights, sexual orientation, etc.? If so, what trends have you seen in that field?
We do ask those. We ask people's political priorities. And what we find is that those social issues are not political priorities across the region, that the priorities remain jobs, education, and healthcare. In several countries, we do get personal rights and civil rights, personal freedom rather, and civil rights in the top four. But in almost every instance, the three sort of economic issues are the absolute priorities. Women's rights are not a big issue. They are in the UAE. They have been at times in Iran. In Tunisia, they were very high because under Bourguiba, you had a very strong effort to bring women in. UAE did a very similar thing to bring women into leadership roles. Even, I mean, I remember in Saudi Arabia, one of the most interesting things, we polled on that question a couple of times, and we found the numbers were not that high at all, to be sure, but the numbers among men who favored women's rights to equality and citizenship were higher than women's numbers. I couldn't explain it, but it was consistent over several years and seemed to indicate that a real trend that was there. So yeah, the social issues are not the preeminent ones, and that's a debate that is not, it's not unusual. I mean, certainly here in the early years of the civil rights movement, you had people in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s who were just becoming aware of a range of social issues, challenging the Black leadership about, why don't you do this? Why don't you do this? Challenging Black women, why don't you advocate for women's rights and equality? And they'd say, first, it's racism. First, it's deal. So it's not unusual that in some groups, one issue will trump over others, even though you might expect it not to.
Yeah.
The principal issues right now are, they want jobs, they want healthcare, they want education, they want to know that their families and their lives are secure.
Thanks, Jim. Somebody is asking about, have you polled about attitudes towards China? China is increasingly present.
Yep.
People feel good about it.
The last chapter in the book is on attitudes towards other countries. America does not do so well. China does very well. China and the EU do the best of all right now. And I think that that's obviously worrisome, and ought to be worrisome, I think, to a whole lot of folk. China's been playing the long game and a very quiet game, and they invest. They invest and don't cause trouble. And when they find the US causing trouble, they say, oh, let us do this and we'll build this road, or we'll build this port, or we'll build this hospital. And they're winning friends with that because they're kind of an uncomplicated suitor that doesn't make demands. And so that's, yeah, China's doing much better than one might expect.
I want to give you a chance to hear sort of your polling among Iranians and Turks. We haven't talked.
Yeah.
Unpack Iranian public opinion. It's a huge question, and Turkish public opinion.
Let me just say this about Iran. I can summarize it this way. When Iranians felt that a deal was being made, and when the deal first got made, they actually, when they turned against their government, in the sense that they said, what do we want now? We want more freedom. We want better jobs. We want the government to invest. If this deal is going to get made, you're going to get money. We want the money invested in our country and in our futures. The minute the Trump election took place and Trump turned against the deal and broke the deal, they then galvanized support around their government and defended it and its foreign escapades, et cetera. It's not illogical, that as much as Americans hated George Bush, Democrats did, after 9/11, everyone supported George Bush. His numbers went up to 80%, remember? And so even though there's dissent in Iran right now, it's not because they love America. And that's one of the myths, I think, that exists, is that Iranians really love America and we ought to blah, blah, blah. Not true at all. They do not view us as a stabilizing force or as a friend at all. And so we actually helped the regime by being opponents of the regime. Iranians, like everybody else, want jobs. They want education, they want healthcare. Those are the things they want. And if their government weren't threatened, they would not want their government involved in escapades beyond the region.
Okay.
I think that pretty much sums it up.
Quick thoughts on Turkey.
Turkey is, that's one place that's really hard to poll in, to be honest with you. We have found that as diverse as some of the other countries are, being able to poll in some of the Kurdish regions presents some challenges. Being able to poll across the border area where being able to distinguish between Syrian refugees and Turks in some area where people aren't telling you the truth also becomes a bit of a challenge. What we find is that Turks are not comfortable with their government's engagement abroad. They also want domestic needs met. But we've learned to limit some of our polling in Turkey to regional issues and not so much local issues. I dare say that if there were one country in the region where we end up with people giving us weird answers because we suspect that they're not comfortable in answering, it's in Turkey. And so the long arm of the AKP seems to have greater impact than one might expect, given the fact that, you know, polling in Iran, people will tell you, I'm dissatisfied. In Saudi Arabia, they'll tell you, as you saw, no, I don't think I had the Saudi numbers there, but 50-something% will say that they're not confident about the future and they're not satisfied with the present, that you won't get those numbers in Turkey. Everybody's happy. And I don't believe it. And so frankly, you know, we have learned to limit our questioning to political issues, not personal reactions to domestic stuff.
Jim, let me end with one broad question. Obviously, we're in an election year. You're part of the Democratic Party, part of the Democratic leadership. I suspect you have a lot of contacts with his foreign policy team or are part of it. If you look back at this decade of polling and the other polling that you've done, and what would, you know, what messages, what lessons learned, if you were to, you know, if there is a Biden election or a Trump re-election, but let's talk about a Biden election, what are the main takeaways or main changes to U.S. Middle East policy that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think, as I said, every time I've gotten a chance to sit with either presidents, vice presidents, or secretaries of state or whatever, and they say, what should we do? I tell them, listen. Listen to people. And it's not just look at the polling, but it's talk to people. Don't talk at them, talk to them, hear their story, and pay attention to what their needs are. We oftentimes will talk to leaders who sometimes tell us what we want to hear, and we never learn to distinguish between sycophancy and the truth. You know, I mean, looking at the all-powerful United States of America, foreign leaders will usually say, oh, you're so wonderful, you're so beautiful, you're so great, like a pickup line in a bar, you know? That's not reality. People across the region, if you look at the polling numbers, are very dissatisfied with the United States. They don't trust the United States, and they don't trust their government's relationship with the United States. And so pay attention to that and build trust. And the way you build trust is by listening to what people want. I would say that the first thing I would ask them to do is undo everything that Trump did in the last 4 years. Undo all of the restrictions on Palestinians, on aid, and on let them reopen the office and dump that embassy in East Jerusalem and reopen the consulate. I would re-engage the Iran nuclear deal, and I would reestablish it, but I would reestablish it with the proviso that we bring into the picture Iran's regional meddling and create a package out of it. I would, you know, with regard to Iraq, look, sectarian government policies are going to continue to plague that country, and ISIS is going to reemerge every time sectarianism rears its ugly head. And so the question is how to engage an Iraqi government to support a non-sectarian approach, and if the US is going to remain there with the status of forces agreement that protects American lives, but also guarantees that America won't step over the line. And I do think that you know, creating a regional framework for negotiated peace between the Gulf states on the Arab side and Iran is absolutely critical. It's something that is not popular in Iran, not popular in the Gulf states, and America doesn't think it can do it. But together with our allies, if we could do an Iran nuclear deal, we can help create a regional peace framework in the region. And those would be, that'd be it. On Israel Palestine, if there are no sanctions on Israeli behavior, then impunity will remain. I mean, like a spoiled child who says, I can get away with it because they're never going to do it. They tell me they'll punish me. They never will. And as long as that continues, why would Israel want to change behavior? And so there must be a clarity about what the consequences of not just annexation, but continued oppression and repression of Palestinian rights will entail. If there are, like I said, if there are no consequences, there's going to continue to be strife and turmoil. So thank you all very much. Yeah, the book is available on Amazon. You can follow me on Twitter at, it's JJZ1600. And I do updates on the polling all the time, JJZ1600. And if you have any questions I didn't get to, you can write me at jzogby at aaiusa.org. And I respond to the questions I get. Thank you all very much, and thanks to NYU.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for that fascinating conversation. We could do much more of it. And thanks to the Young Leaders Network at the John Brademas Center of New York University. Thanks for the audience for joining us. Buy the book, read the book, and have a good week, everybody. Bye-bye.